The Woman in the Walls by J.P. O'Brien. The slow drip panic that had been steadily accumulating over decades was at last pushing Mrs. Tracy to her breaking point. Threats of danger were coming from all sides: wildfires and floods, crime and corruption, war. Upheaval of each and every variety cascading through her television screen and eroding her from the ground up. It felt like the intense chaos was crushing her frail bones without so much as a second glance, like she were a flimsy cardboard box caught in a hydraulic press. This is no way to live, she concluded. Finally, defeated, she unfastened the clips covering one of the air vents in her kitchen, stood on the padded stool in her slippers, then gradually eased herself inside the walls. It can't get me in here, she thought to herself as she replaced the vent cover behind her. Mrs. Tracy's building on the north side of Midlake had about a dozen apartments in it. One of the other apartments on the same floor as hers had recently been rented to a young woman and her 10-year-old son. The son, Matty Carson, was a sensitive and quiet boy who, even under routine circumstances, had trouble summoning the courage to go out and make friends. But now, in the aftermath of his small family's relocation, not to mention the recent devastating loss of his father, he was more adamant than ever about remaining in the safety of his room. "I won't know anyone," he would whine whenever his mother tried to coax him out. "Well, obviously, Professor," she sighed through the door. "That's exactly why you need to try." Matty's mother, Julie, was certainly more outgoing than he was. In that particular regard, at least, the young boy had undeniably taken after his late father. But, echoing whatever magic had caused those two opposites to attract back when they first met in college, Julie had always been amused and charmed by her young son's exaggerated introversion. She felt the exact same compulsion to try and fix him as she had with his father. And just as she had occasionally succeeded in getting the senior Carson to step out into the big, scary world by teasing him about the unfoundedness of his concerns, she became convinced that her role in her son's life was the same. She felt she had even been making good progress too, until the drunk driver that had taken Matty's father's life just 6 months earlier set her back countless steps. Pretty much overnight, Matty had once again become convinced that there was nothing for him out of doors. It had been a couple of weeks since the two of them had spent their first night in the new apartment, and although there were still 1 or 2 low-priority boxes waiting in the hallway to be unpacked, which were currently serving as de facto key and coat stands, Julie and Matty were, for the most part, settled. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and Julie was giving some attention to the row of potted plants sitting on the sunny tiled ledge above the kitchen sink. Matty, meanwhile, had secluded himself in his room to draw at his desk with the blinds lowered. This was something he preferred to do whenever he wasn't being forced to go to school. Around him in the dimness sat several stacks of sketch paper made up of various finished and unfinished drawings, as well as a scattered mess of colouring pencils. In the middle of it was his current piece, a pencil sketch of a gadget-heavy spy car he had imagined, illuminated sharply by the circular spotlight of his desk lamp. Among other details, the car had a heavily reinforced steel body, spring-loaded fenders, and a padded driver's ejector seat. He was adding the last touches when he was startled by an unfamiliar sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere very near. He froze, sitting alone in the dark room, and waited for the unidentified noise to return, but everything was silent, save for the distant sounds of a barking dog and his mother running a tap at the other end of the apartment. Matty slowly returned to his sketch, but moved quietly, on edge, like an animal in the wild. Barely 2 seconds had passed when he heard the sound again, an arrhythmic shuffling that appeared to come from the wall beside his bed. He stopped again, perked his ear up, put his pencil down on the desk as silently as he possibly could, and tiptoed over to where he thought this weird shuffling was originating. By the time he had lightly placed his ear against the plaster, the sound was gone. With his heart beating loudly in his chest, he burst out of his room and hurried down the hallway to his mother in the kitchen, whom he found tapping her pursed lips with soil-dusted fingers while considering the arrangement of some flower pots. "Mum," Matty hissed in an urgent whisper. "I heard a noise in the walls." "What kind of noise?" she answered, with nothing like the same urgency. "It sounded like someone was behind the wall, moving around in there." Julie looked at him and raised an eyebrow. "Well, we do have neighbours here, sweetheart," she said flatly. "I don't think it's them," was Matty's tense reply. "It sounded too close." A mischievous smirk surfaced on Matty's mother's face, and the inclination to tease her young son proved, once again, too compelling to ignore. "Well, not to worry," she dismissed. "You probably just heard the woman in the walls." "The... what?" Matty knew from experience that his mother loved to spin these tall tales. He also knew that any display of gullibility from him would surely be an invitation for her to continue, and so he tried to stop his face before it betrayed his genuine shock. But it was too late. She had already begun. Sometimes in these old apartment buildings, back in the old days, they used to hire someone to keep things running. The lifts, the lights, the heating, things like that. They all needed to be operated somehow. "But all that stuff is electric," Matty responded. He was about 50% sure of the accuracy of his own answer. "Oh, you kids these days, you think everything is just automatic." She returned her attention to the plants, switched two of them around on the windowsill, then put them both back to their original positions and nodded in approval. Then she went on. "Push a button and things just turn on by magic. But there used to be a time when someone would be needed to make the magic happen, behind the scenes, behind the walls. Never thought of that, did you, smart guy?" Matty scratched his head as Julie drove on, amusing herself. "Whenever you turn on a light switch, the woman in the walls has to scurry up to the light bulb to turn it on. I bet you didn't know that. She's the one who does it, not electricity." She punctuated her last word with clownishly sarcastic emphasis, while flailing her fingers into large air quotes, flicking several specks of soil onto the floor between them. She then got back to fluffing up the plant's leaves, her hums signifying that the conversation was over. Matty made a point to roll his eyes on his way out of the kitchen to tell her that he was unfazed. It was only when he was safely behind his closed door again that his vigilance for the unidentified noises returned. The boy's mother may have actually done more damage than she realized by trying to be silly and playful with her son in this instance. Ever since the unexpected loss of his dad, Matty had become particularly vulnerable to the potential hazards in his surroundings. The newly revealed presence of this supposed woman lurking just inches from where he slept would prove too disturbing for him to ignore. He spent much of the afternoon listening to the walls with his ear pressed against an empty glass tumbler, trying to distinguish the noises of water sloshing through pipes in the bowels of the building and his clumsy neighbours conversing or clattering around distantly in their own homes. None of these were the sounds he had heard. The shuffling noise from before had felt far too close. Unknown to either of them, Matty's mother had accidentally touched on the truth, of course. The old Mrs. Tracy, who had earlier scurried inside her air vent to escape an ever more frightening world, was indeed the source of the unsettling shuffling that Matty had heard from his desk. While he was putting the final touches on his spy car drawing, she was making herself at home just a few short feet away. She had discovered that the gap between the exterior walls of the building and those of the individual apartment units, particularly the one immediately alongside the Carsons' dwelling, afforded her just enough space to nestle into the warm and comforting insulation material, and she had become quite comfortable there. The noise that had caused Matty to hurry to his mother in the kitchen was Mrs. Tracy squeezing herself into a cosy ball against the other side of his wall, where she promptly fell asleep. She would have no idea of the profound effect her inadvertent noises were having on her young neighbour, however. On her side of the wall, she dozed peacefully, her oblivious head cradled by the spongy fluff between the supporting beams. Meanwhile, on the other, this boy was working himself up into a frenzy, listening closely through the glass all over his walls and floor, with the hairs on the back of his neck bristled and his strained nervous system on high alert. But with the source of the earlier sounds now fast asleep, there was no movement, and consequently nothing for Matty to hear. By serendipitous timing, it was only when Matty left his room to go and have dinner with his mother a few hours later that Mrs. Tracy's rumbling stomach gradually awoke her, and she, too, set off in search of food. By the time Matty got back to his post to resume a frustratingly fruitless search, she was elsewhere in the building. The poor boy had tremendous difficulty sleeping that night. He was haunted by the image of an old lady with terrifying long limbs and freakish fingernails scurrying around behind the walls like a spider, tapping and scratching as she went. His overactive imagination fed him visions of her scrutinizing him through the cracks along the skirting boards or along the edge of the light switches, watching with a villainous grin, waiting until her victim's guard was sufficiently down before she slipped out and kidnapped him. "It's just my mum making things up," he said out loud to himself, without much conviction at all. "There's no woman in the walls, and if there is, she's just making sure the lights turn on because that's her job. She doesn't want to kidnap me. She doesn't want to kidnap me." Repeating this mantra, his exhausted eyes eventually drooped closed, and he drifted to sleep with all the lights on and clutching a plastic ruler in his hands for protection. When Julie noticed his uncontrollable yawning and bleary eyes at the breakfast table the following morning, she suspected he had stayed up at his desk until far too late the previous night, working on those drawings of his. She had completely forgotten the story about the woman in the walls that she had made up to tease him. "You ought to be getting to bed earlier," was all she said, filling up his glass with a second helping of orange juice. Matty, who did not want to admit that a seed his mother had planted in his head, a ridiculous one at that, had tormented him to the point of sleeplessness, just nodded and agreed, then pulled a cereal box across the table to hide behind. But the woman in the walls wasn't trying to spook Matty. She wasn't even conscious of affecting anyone at all. Her plan had simply been to get away from a world she had grown to fear. It was a victimless action as far as she was concerned, and she didn't even consider whether someone else would notice it. So she was especially surprised when, trying to slide into her comfortable napping spot for another pleasant little midday snooze, she heard a muffled, high-pitched voice coming from the other side of the wall, which oddly seemed to be addressing her. By the time she fell still against the wooden beams and tuned her ears into what was being said, she only caught the second half of the voice's diatribe. "Usually does this, and I don't believe her, but just so I know, could you please let me know that you are not really a woman in the walls?" "Hello?" was all Mrs. Tracy could think to say. The wimpish scream and subsequent clattering startled her, but she was more concerned for whoever seemed to have hurt themselves than to remain hidden, so she spoke again, a little louder this time. "Are you all right over there?" Matty collected himself from his tangle on the floor and righted the chair that he had tumbled over, but made sure that it remained between himself and the wall that was now speaking. He kept still, trying his best to make sense of this, and two thoughts popped into his head. One, there was undoubtedly a voice, far too near to be one of the neighbours, and two, it was clearly addressing him. He decided that remaining silent would be pointless. "Are you the woman in the walls?" he managed to ask. After a few seconds of thoughtful silence, during which Mrs. Tracy was also deciding whether to engage or remain hidden, Her gentle, muffled voice said, "I suppose I'm a woman in the walls." Matty could hear that the voice was raspy, a little tired and slow, but affectionate and kind. It reminded him of Mrs. Dyson, the round, grey-haired lady who had been his friendly kindergarten teacher many years before. He suddenly doubted that she was part woman, part spider like he had suspected. In fact, she no longer seemed threatening at all. A sinister creature who sets out to kidnap little boys from their bedrooms probably wouldn't ask if they were all right over there, he thought. His hand lingered on the chair as he moved around it towards the wall. Without doubt, there was a woman in there speaking to him. It was not his imagination. He decided to ask if it was her job to keep the lights and heating on in the building. The wall chuckled. "What? No. I think all of that is done by electricity," it said. His mother's gesture of sarcastic air quotes from the previous day flashed in Matty's mind, and along with it, the revelation that she had, after all, been making one of her trademark jibes that he didn't get. He felt a wash of relief all through his body, but the feeling was only momentary. That didn't quite explain this woman in the wall. He tensed up again. "Why are you in there?" he asked. "Well," the voice said before hesitating, looking for the right words. "To be honest, I was getting a little worn out. I wanted to go somewhere safer." Matty's eyes widened. He knew exactly what this person meant. Whoever it was in there seemed to be saying very reasonable things, as far as Matty could tell. He, too, had wondered how he could make himself feel safer from time to time, although the thought of crawling inside the walls had honestly not occurred to him until this moment. "Does that mean you're hiding?" he asked, hoisting himself up onto his knees on the bed. He tried to picture the woman speaking behind his wall. Though she sounded like an old lady, the sentiment could just as easily have been coming from a child. "Well, yes, I suppose I am hiding," came the gentle voice. "There just seemed to be too much out there to be afraid of." Mrs. Tracy, on her side of the wall, was also trying to work out the face behind the voice that she could hear. He was evidently a small boy. It suddenly occurred to her that her presence right next to this boy's bedroom must have truly frightened him. The startled crash that came when she first spoke was proof of that. So she apologized profusely for causing a scare. Matty puffed out his chest, even though no one was in the room to see it, and quickly contested that he hadn't really been scared at all. He then remembered the hours he had wasted the previous day straining to listen for any noises through a glass. He still felt tired from a restless night, terrified of being kidnapped. He dropped his gaze to his hands resting on his knees. "Well, I was a little scared," he admitted. "Oh, you poor thing," said the old woman. "I hope you know that wasn't my intention for even 1 second. It's awful to be scared." There was no response. "I'm Mrs. Tracy. What's your name?" "Matty." "I'm delighted to meet you, Matty." Mrs. Tracy then told the story of having lived in her apartment for many years, but as she got older, she explained, the things that had come to scare her were piling up and becoming more and more overwhelming. So much so that she could hardly take it. As he listened to the warm voice speak, Matty made himself comfortable by sitting with his back up against the plaster and his feet dangling off the edge of the bed. He could feel the faintest of vibrations in his body as the soft words bounced off the other side of the wall. They soothed him. "Being 10 can be pretty scary too," Matty offered. "Oh?" answered Mrs. Tracy. "I've just been afraid of everything recently," said Matty. "I hate it. I don't like to leave my room." "Well, that doesn't sound very good. Someone your age has lots of reasons to go out into the world. We need young, thoughtful people like you to help make things better out there," she said. Why do you think you're scared?" Matty's bottom lip was beginning to quiver. He was thinking about his dad. His head slumped forward between his knees. "It's dangerous outside," was all he could muster. "Yes, that's true," Mrs. Tracy conceded helplessly. "The world can indeed be a dangerous place." By now, she was sitting with her own back to the wall. They sat together in a contemplative silence for a moment. "My dad was in a car accident," Matty said at last. "It wasn't his fault. The other driver lost control and hit him, and he died." His voice was quiet, but his words were powerful and sincere. He had spent countless hours trying to unravel the meaning behind them. They were almost incomprehensible for a 10-year-old. Mrs. Tracy's face paled, and she felt a sharp pain in her heart. "My goodness," she said. "I am so sorry to hear that. You poor boy. Facing the world after something so terrible would take an extraordinary amount of courage for anyone. It really would." A tear silently rolled down Matty's cheek. Mrs. Tracy could feel the intense sadness permeating through the wall against her back. She, of course, had lived many years, long enough to grow gradually more fearful of the world over time, but it seemed unfair that someone so young should be exposed to such heartache from the beginning. She wanted to hug this child, but her enclosure was preventing her from doing so. And despite feeling just as overwhelmed about the dangers of the world as he did, she was suddenly overcome with the intense obligation to try to persuade this young boy not to be afraid anymore. "You know, you remind me of a boy I knew once," she began. "He was very scared of what was outside too. He used to stay in his room because that was the only place he felt safe. But even that was not enough. So, one day, he crawled into an air vent and made a hiding place for himself behind the walls of his building, to get away from the things out in the world that scared him." Matty sniffed and waited for Mrs. Tracy to go on. "Unfortunately, one of his neighbours, an elderly woman, could hear the boy scurrying around behind her own wall in the night, and it gave her such a fright that she collapsed and needed to be taken to the hospital." Matty gasped. "Was she all right?" Mrs. Tracy chuckled at his empathy. He seemed to have forgotten his own woes at the mere mention of the distress of another. "Oh yes, she was fine. Don't worry. It would take more than a few noises to cause her any real harm." "But," she went on, "when the boy learned he had been responsible, he resolved that he wasn't going to hide like that anymore. He realized that hiding is not always the best way to handle your fears. It may feel good at first because you're temporarily escaping them. But all you're really doing is restricting yourself. And if you do that, that lets the fears win." Mrs. Tracy was fabricating this story, of course. There had been no little boy in the walls. But when she had begun speaking, she realized that there was a crystal clear point. She should be following her own advice. As if reading her mind, Matty asked Mrs. Tracy why she was allowed to be in the walls if the boy in her story had understood that he ought not to be. The old woman exhaled and accepted defeat. Fears come in different forms, but everyone has them, she realized. Not letting them get to you is what's important. "You're right," she said. "How about we make a deal? I'll agree to leave my hiding place in the walls and learn to handle my own fears, if you agree to leave your room and try to accept the world for what it is, a place that is sometimes scary, but that still needs you in it." Matty didn't reply, but allowed the offer to tumble around in his head. "You were scared of the noise you heard, weren't you?" Mrs. Tracy recalled. "Yes. But you still confronted it to get to the bottom of it." I wanted to know if there really was a woman in the walls, he said modestly. Well, there you go. You do have it in you. You just need to remind yourself of that courage. The two of them continued to talk through Matty's bedroom wall for quite a while, sharing about their respective lives and fears, until Mrs. Tracy realised that there were no longer any responses coming from her young neighbour, and that he had, in all likelihood, dozed off. At that point, Mrs. Tracy looked herself up and down. Her clothes were dusty and creased from having spent the previous 24 hours moving between the gaps of the building's walls. Her neck was stiff from not being able to stretch out, and constant contact with the itchy insulating fluff had caused a slight rash to form on her hands and forearms. She was desperate for the toilet. She knew at once that this had not been an appropriate way for her to handle things. So she carefully made her way back along the support beams until she once again reached the air vent leading to her own kitchen. The padded stool was still in place from where she had used it to hoist herself up. A cloud of dust puffed up when she eased herself back down onto it. Then she sat at her kitchen table and penned a short note. When she had finished, she folded it, then went out of her front door and slipped it underneath the door behind which her courageous new friend lived. Julie, who had been letting her son sleep off his late night of drawing, placed her ear against Matty's door in that moment to check on him. There was still no peep from behind it. But when she turned to walk back up the hallway, she noticed the note lying on the doormat. The words inside baffled her. Thank you for helping me get over my fears. I hope I can help you do the same. More bizarrely, it was signed by the woman in the walls, and only then did she remember her tall tale from the previous day. She suspected this was Matty's attempt at a prank on her, a way for him to try to get his own back on her for teasing him about it. But the handwriting was very convincingly not her son's. Strange, she mused to herself, before folding the note back up and leaving it on the kitchen table for Matty to find when he emerged. You have been listening to JP O'Brien's stories. For more, visit patreon.com/JP O'Brien Stories.